This is our latest memorial because this is the place really where the Channel Dash started as far as the Fleet Air Arm were concerned, and I'll give you more history when we're inside. But why it's so poignant when we are in RAF Museum is because the 6 sawfish actually were parked on this fence. The towers were all here, just here, up to the tower on this corner. So you can imagine 6 sawfish torpedo bombers with torpedoes sitting here waiting to go. The day that the Germans chose, and I'll come back to that again, so I'm going to skip it a bit, was really bad weather. But we knew they were coming, so the planes were sent up here. So when the planes knew that the Germans were coming and they were told to leave, they left. But there was no fighter escort, didn't turn up. So this memorial is a twin to the one down at Ramsgate Harbour, because they went down to Ramsgate and circled over the harbour, waiting for the Spitfires to come, of which there were due was 6 squadrons, until they got to a point where it was either come back to Manston and refuel, or go off and chase the ships, which had already gone through by then, and were back to 35 knots into a headwind, which was no good for the sawfish. So there's 2 organisations. There's the CDA, which is the Channel Dash Association, and then there's the Fleet Air Arm Association, and they're a little bit rivalry. So we've got one memorial, and the other group have done the one down at Ramsgate Harbour, which is beside the old steam tug in the harbour and the Maritime Museum. And in fact it's going to be near the new Hornby Museum with all the models, because they're moving out from their place in Margate. And this was unveiled, I think it was 2 years ago, on this date, yeah, last year. But it's very nice. And sadly, we actually contributed £1,000 as well as the site from the museum for this memorial, because they didn't have a lot of money. And then they forgot to invite us to the unveiling. And I knew it was happening, and I stood over there. All the dignitaries were here and all the Fleet Air Arm people. Not one came across and spoke to us. But we've got the memorial. Now I explained outside the relevance of the Channel Dash here because that's a Fleet Air Arm action, but because it was the base for the sawfish, we've taken a particular interest because we do have the support of the Fleet Air Arm Association. And they actually provided and paid for this banner, which explains all about what happened. The action started when Hitler ordered these 3 warships, which are on display there, the sister battleships, the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, and the battle cruiser Prince Eugen, to return from Brest back to Germany and up into the Baltic, Hamburg area. And the instruction was given to the Admiral to leave when he thought it was right, particularly relevant to bad weather. Now we knew what that signal was because of Enigma, but we couldn't tell anybody we knew, because that would then disclose, which they didn't want to do, that we were decoding the Enigma. But we had these other 2 ways of sorting it out. One was a former French naval officer in Brest, and he reported back independently that he was watching these ships prepare for sea because they were provisioning as sailors were returning to the ships. Also, we had a man in a farmhouse outside of town who knew, he had contact with this sailor, and he had a radio. So he was passing messages back to England. There was a problem. In fact, there were several problems. One was, because nobody knew, except the very top brass in the Royal Air Force, that what was happening, that they had these planes that were marked out in blue, flying around looking for the ships when they departed, but some other high-ranking officer who didn't know ordered a bombing raid on the U-boat pens in the same docks. And that delayed the sailing until the time you can see, which shows them leaving at 22:45. And they sailed through the RS Cordon and they were not seen. And they got up to off Le Havre in Dieppe before they were spotted by a unexpected Spitfire patrol when two senior officers in Spitfires, I forget the name, one of the wing commander, I think Rowley Bowman Beamont was one of them, and they were just flying around, just looking. They were told to go and look. They weren't told why, but they were told total radio silence. So when they spotted these Germans through a break in the cloud, they had to go back to Tangier, find a telephone, ring somebody in London and talk to somebody who knew what was happening and say, we've seen them. And that was the first we knew, right up there.
You sent them a text.
Because they'd been told total radio silence. Okay, right, so I'm now going to backtrack to the day of the night when they sailed, which was the 11th. The guy in charge of the 6 Sawfish was this fellow, Eugene Esmond. A strange character. He came from Southern Ireland and his family were really Republican and hated the British, but they hated the Germans more. So he and his brothers enlisted in the British military to fight the Germans, and he became a lieutenant commander. And you can see up here in his name, he got a DSO. That was for leading a flight of Sawfish from the Ark Royal against the Bismarck. So if I take you around to this corner here, we've got this picture. Here he is. This isn't just any old picture. This was him having come to Manston in his Sawfish, caught the train from Margate in his number 1 uniform to Buckingham Palace and collected his DSO from the King and shaken hands with him. A man he didn't like. And that's him the day before the action when he flew off. So that in itself is quite remarkable. We'll return back here later. So, I told you outside that they took off from here. The group captain in charge of the airfield came out of the control tower, shook hands with him, they saluted, and the group captain said, "You won't be back, will you?" He said, "No sir, we won't." And it was a volunteer mission for all 18 men. It wasn't an order. They could have said, "No, we're not going to do it." And both Esmond and the group captain knew that this was going to be a one-way trip. So when they took off, and they were circling over Ramsgate, waiting for the Spitfires that didn't show up on time. And that was because the weather in the UK was a lot worse than the French side. And they couldn't get off from Biggin Hill, Kenley, and I think Westmoreland. All right. The Sawfish had to make a decision to go and attack on their own. But as I said, they were doing. The warships had gone through the gap, back to 35 knots, with their destroyer screen and their E-boat screen, and their minesweepers, because they had minesweepers in front clearing the channel. And you can see, in fact, further up after this action finished, they did actually catch 3 mines that didn't really do any damage. So they decided to go, but the 35 knots on the headwind, these guys can only do 90. So virtually, there was no chance, but they called them up and they started attacking. Because they were running in daylight, as you can see the time scale, which we didn't expect. We never thought they'd run the channel in daytime. We thought it'd be night time. We come to this picture. These are 2 Royal Navy MTBs, 48, 45. There was a flotilla of 6 in both Ramsgate Harbour and Dover Harbour. But they'd been sent out the night before, as these guys were leaving, to harass German convoys off the French coast. When the order came for these guys to go out to support the action, these were the only 2 that were able to go. For different reasons, like damage, breakdowns, crew problems, lack of ammunition, whatever. These ones were the only ones that went. And a guy walked in and said to me, about a few times I was here, about 5-6 years ago, he said to me, this picture, which is the official picture, showing Spitfires and the Swordfish and the battleship, is a total lie. I said, really? I said, that's our picture. He said, well, it's not. He said, tell me more. He said, this is the truth. I said, okay, tell me more. He said, I've just painted it. Okay, tell me more. That's me in the black southwestern oilskin on that MTB. And we were out there. There were no Spitfires overhead. At the time of the attack going in, they came later. There was a lot of Germans. And we'll talk about Adolf Galland a bit later on. And Adolf Galland had always 150 Luftwaffe aircraft, 109s, 190s and Messerschmitt 110s, the twin engines, over the fleet all the time. And they were attacking and shooting at the Swordfish. But the German rear admiral on the battleship figured out a way to get rid of the Swordfish, and he described it to me, this guy. And this is what he wrote. His name is R.J. Mitchell, pure coincidence with the Spitfire designer. And this is what he said. And he said the Germans fired their main armament into the sea and attempted to drown the Swordfish, who were coming in low because of a torpedo approach, had to be just above the waves. And he said the first flight that went in, that involved Esmond and his crew, who all died, and this guy died on the aircraft on one side and the aircraft on the other, which the crew were rescued. He said, we were the people who rescued the two from this aircraft and the three-man crew from the other. We watched these three go through these big water spouts, like you can see there, and we never saw them again. They just disappeared. We couldn't find them, and our time was up and we had to come back. And we brought back the 5. And while that gunner died, the pilot was wounded and the navigator got him out. And the pilot, I think, survived. So, I think that's an extremely poignant picture. You won't see it reproduced anywhere with that story. So we come to the end of the story. You can see up here, Esmond's got the VC. He got the VC for this action, obviously, posthumously. Now you know, generally, if you go to the palace for an award, it's recipient +1 or posthumously 2. His brothers were invited to go to the palace and get a VC. They said to their boss, we think Mother should come. And because Esmond was Navy, the Admiral of the fleet said, yeah, I agree. Go and find your mother. I said, well, she's in Southern Ireland. He said, well, my plane's up in Liverpool. Speke Airport?
Yeah.
And he said, go to Liverpool, from wherever they were, get my plane, here's the orders, fly to Londonderry, get a car, go over the border, get Mother in a wheelchair because she was disabled, and bring her back to London. And there's Mother shaking the hands of the king, the man she hated the most, receiving the VC with her 2 sons either side. It's not quite the end of the story. We'll go back here. Nobody thought anymore, and the war went on. And a month later, Esmond's body is washed up at Gillingham. And this is his gravestone, where he is now interred in the cemetery up there. And he was identified by the signet ring on his hand. So he has a row of bullets down the spine, where he'd been shot by, obviously, a fighter. But he managed to release his seatbelts before the plane sunk. And that's why we can conclude the story of what happened to Esmond. And up your way, you could go and see that gravestone. And it will be another place to visit